Picture yourself standing in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. The fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. Glass cases line the walls, each holding fragments of worlds that no longer exist. Your footsteps echo on polished floors as you move through rooms filled with pottery shards, bronze tools, stone tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that look more like bird tracks than writing. In the corner of the Mesopotamian gallery, a small clay prism rests on a pedestal. About 20 centimetres tall, roughly 8 inches, 4 sides, covered entirely in cuneiform script, those strange triangular impressions pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. The label reads, Weld-Blundell Prism, circa 1800 BCE. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. But this object holds something that should make us all pause. It contains what might be the most unsettling historical document ever discovered. A list of kings. A chronicle of rulers who governed the ancient land of Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq. 8 kings before a great flood swept over the land. Then 134 more kings after the waters receded. The unsettling part isn't the number of kings, it's how long they reigned. The first king, Alalim, ruled for 2800 years. The second, Al-Aljar, for 36,000 years. King after king, reign after reign, stretching for tens of thousands of years. 8 kings total, their combined rule lasting 200 years. Then, according to the tablet, the flood swept over everything. After the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven once more. But something had changed. The kings who came after the flood lived shorter lives. Still impossibly long by our standards, hundreds of years, sometimes over 1,000, but nothing like the antediluvian rulers. As you continue through more reigns, the numbers shrink further. 700 years, 400, 200, until finally, by the time we reach kings, we can verify through other historical records, the reign lengths match normal human lifespans. It reads like a civilization slowly forgetting how to live forever. Tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts begin to drift, we're going to explore what this clay prism might be telling us. Not about mythology, not about ancient exaggerations or symbolic numbers, but about something far more profound. What if this list isn't myth at all? What if it's a compressed record of something real, a memory of civilizations that rose and fell long before Sumer, each one rising higher than the last, each one eventually swept away? Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word. Some nights you'll drift in and out. That's perfect. This is for wanderers, for those who lie awake wondering if the history we've been taught is complete, for those who sense that beneath the official story something older waits. If this journey through shadow and deep time resonates with you, fellow wanderer, a gentle light helps other seekers find these stories. I'm curious, where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Let me know in the comments. Now let us descend into the archive, into the dust, into the question that haunts every civilization. What came before? The clay is cool beneath your fingertips. Imagine holding one of these Sumerian tablets, 4,000 years of history preserved in mud. The scribe who pressed these marks into soft clay did so with purpose, with reverence. This wasn't a casual record. This was sacred chronology. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They built the first cities we know of, Eridu, Uruk, Ur. They invented the wheel, developed complex irrigation, created the first known system of writing. They gave us the concept of time divided into hours, minutes, and seconds. The mathematics we use to measure circles, the calendar we still follow, they were, by every archaeological measure, the beginning of civilization. But they themselves claim they were not the beginning. In the opening lines of the king list, the text states simply, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not kingship began or kingship was created, it descended. It came from somewhere else, somewhere higher. Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, perhaps the oldest city on Earth. When archaeologists excavated its ruins at Tel Abu-Sharain in southern Iraq, they found layer upon layer of temples, each built directly on top of the ruins of the one before, stretching back to around 5400 BCE. 17 temples, one atop another, each generation rebuilding what the previous generation had built. keeping the same sacred geometry, the same orientation, as if following a blueprint that predated them all. And beneath the temples, beneath the oldest foundations, archaeologists found something else, a layer of clean silt, river sediment. Nearly beton, feet thick in some places, the unmistakable signature of a massive flood. Then, below the flood layer, more evidence of human habitation. Older pottery, different styles, people who lived before the deluge, before the Sumerians, as we know them, existed. The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who excavated Ur in the 20s and 30s, found similar flood deposits at multiple sites across Mesopotamia. Not everywhere, but at Ur, at Uruk, at Kish, at Shuruppak, each city showing evidence of catastrophic inundation around 2900 BCE, separating older settlements from newer ones. The physical evidence matches what the clay tablets say. There was a time before, then there was a flood, then there was a time after. But the king list suggests something more. Those 8 antediluvian kings ruling for 250,000 years total, what if they represent something we've forgotten how to interpret? Modern scholars dismiss the numbers as mythical, symbolic, impossible, and if we insist they represent individual human lifespans, they are indeed impossible. No human lives for 30,000 years, not in our understanding of biology, of cellular decay, of mortality. But what if we're reading it wrong? What if those numbers don't represent individual lifespans, but something else entirely? Dynasties, eras, entire cycles of civilization rising and falling compressed into the reigns of archetypal kings. Consider how we talk about history now. We speak of the Victorian era as if Queen Victoria personally shaped every aspect of those decades. We refer to the Renaissance as a single coherent period, even though it spanned centuries and countless individual lives. We compress time into symbolic figures. The ancient mind did this even more naturally. Time was not linear for them. It was cyclical, repeating, mythic. Kings were not just political rulers, they were cosmic figures, axis points around which entire ages turned. So when the Sumerian scribe wrote that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, some researchers propose he might have meant something like, during the first great age when kingship first came to earth, there was an epoch of order that lasted immeasurable generations. We call this the Age of Alulim. And when he wrote that the flood swept over, the text could imply. Then came a great disruption, a resetting of the world, after which everything began again, smaller, newer, diminished. This interpretation, while not accepted by mainstream scholarship, unlocks something haunting. The pattern encoded in the king list matches patterns found in other ancient traditions, cultures that had no contact with Sumer, no way of sharing stories across vast distances and language barriers. Let's step away from Mesopotamia for a moment. Let's travel east to the Indus Valley, to the sacred texts of ancient India, the Hindu concept of yugas. 4 great ages through which the world cycles endlessly. Satya Yuga, the age of truth, Treta Yuga, the silver age, Dwapara Yuga, the bronze age, and Kali Yuga, the iron age, the age of darkness in which, according to Hindu tradition, we currently live. Each yuga is shorter than the one before. Each yuga sees humanity and civilization decline in virtue, in lifespan, in spiritual power. In the Satya Yuga, humans lived for thousands of years, possessed great wisdom, walked in harmony with divine forces. By Kali Yuga, lifespans are short, violence is common, ignorance prevails, the proportions are precise, the 4 yugas follow a ratio of 4:3 to 2:1. Satya Yuga lasts 1,200 years. Treta Yuga lasts 1 to 6,000 years. Dwapara Yuga lasts 4,000 years. Kali Yuga lasts 42,000 years. Together they form one Mahayuga, one great cycle, lasting for 20,000 years. Then after Kali Yuga reaches its darkest point, the world is destroyed and reborn. The cycle begins again with a new Satya Yuga, a new golden age. This is not linear time. This is not progress. This is the wheel, turning eternally. And here's what should make us pause. The structure of the Hindu yugas eerily mirrors the structure of the Sumerian king list. Long ages before a cataclysm, shorter ages after, progressive decline in some essential quality, whether that quality is virtue, wisdom, or simply the capacity to live. 2 ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, both preserving the same basic pattern, long ages, cataclysm, shorter ages, reset. The ancient Greeks had their own version, the 5 ages of man, the Golden Age when humans lived like gods free from toil and suffering. The Silver Age, still peaceful but less wise. The Bronze Age, warlike and violent. The Heroic Age, the time of the great heroes of Greek myth. And finally the Iron Age, their own present, characterised by moral decay and endless labour. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, placed himself in the Iron Age and lamented that he wished he had been born in an earlier time. He looked backward with longing, not forward with hope. The pattern repeats in Norse mythology, the cyclical destruction and rebirth of the world through Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The world tree Yggdrasil binding together 9 realms that will all burn and then be born again from the ashes. In ancient Persia, Zoroastrian tradition spoke of world ages of 3,000 years each, 12,000 years in total, after which the world would be perfected and time itself would end. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Mayans both preserved calendars based on vast cycles. The Aztec 5 suns, each representing a different world age, each ending in catastrophic destruction. The current world, they believed, was the 5th sun, doomed like the others to eventually perish. The Mayan long count calendar, which caused so much apocalyptic anxiety in 2012, was tracking a cycle of 5,025 years. But the Mayans themselves knew this was merely one Baktun, one cycle within larger cycles. Above the Baktun was the Piktun, lasting 785 years. Above that, the Kalabtun, lasting 158,000 years. And above that, the Kinchiltun, lasting over 3 million years. They were thinking in deep time, in cycles within cycles within cycles, like wheels within wheels, grinding through ages most of us can barely imagine. If you're still with me, wonderful. If you've drifted, that's fine too. Let the ideas wash over you like water, like the flood itself. This is for those who wonder, for seekers in the dark. Across the globe, from Mesopotamia to India to Greece to Scandinavia to Mexico, cultures that never met, that spoke different languages, that had no trade routes or communication with each other, all told the same essential story. There were ages before this one, long ages, golden ages, ages when humans lived differently, knew more, lived longer. Then came catastrophe, flood, fire, destruction, the world reset, and we began again, smaller, younger, with less knowledge than we had before. Why would they all tell this story if there wasn't some truth embedded in it? The standard explanation is convergent evolution of myth. Humans everywhere experience floods, fires, natural disasters. We all fear death. We all experience cultural decline as we age, and see the younger generation as less disciplined than our own. So we project these universal human experiences onto cosmic timescales, creating myths of golden ages and apocalypses. This explanation is neat, it's rational, it might even be partially true, but it doesn't quite account for the specificity. The precise ratios in the Hindu yugas, the exact reign lengths in the Sumerian king list, the detailed descriptions of what life was like in those earlier ages. These aren't vague once-upon-a-time stories. They contain detail, structure, mathematics, names, chronologies. What if they're not just psychological projections? What if they're memories? Not perfect memories. Not literal histories in the way we write history now, but cultural memories, passed down through oral tradition for so long that the stories became mythologized, the numbers became sacred, the events became divine interventions rather than natural processes. But beneath the mythology, a core of truth. There were civilizations before the ones we know, and they ended. The geological record supports the possibility. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the world experienced dramatic climate change. Massive ice sheets that had covered North America and Europe for tens of thousands of years melted rapidly. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines where humans had likely lived for millennia were inundated, submerged beneath the expanding oceans. This event, known as Meltwater Pulse 1a, occurred relatively quickly in geological terms, over the span of a few centuries. For people living through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. Their villages swallowed by rising waters, their hunting grounds transformed into seas, their entire world fundamentally changed. If there had been coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, and this remains speculative, though coastlines do provide prime resources for early humans, they would have been destroyed utterly, their remains now hundreds of feet underwater, largely inaccessible to modern archaeology. We know that humans have been anatomically modern for at least 200,000 years. behaviourally modern for perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 years. That's 50,000 years of humans just as intelligent as we are, just as capable of innovation, living and dying and building and creating. And we have solid archaeological evidence for what? The last 10,000 years. The rise of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, the first cities in Sumer, the early dynasties of Egypt. That leaves 40,000 to 60,000 years unaccounted for. What were humans doing all that time? The standard narrative says, not much. Hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands, living hand-to-mouth, leaving behind some cave paintings, some stone tools, but no cities, no writing, no complex civilization. But what if some of them did build complex societies? Small ones, perhaps, localized. Not global empires, but regional cultures with trade networks, astronomical knowledge, sophisticated oral traditions. And what if those cultures, built along Ice Age coastlines, were simply erased when the ice melted? We would have no way of finding them. The ocean doesn't preserve architecture well. Stone foundations break apart. Organic materials decay. After 12,000 years underwater, even monumental structures would be reduced to ambiguous rock formations that look like natural geology. There are hints, though, anomalies that don't quite fit the accepted timeline. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone temples built around 9500 BCE, featuring carved pillars weighing over 15 tons each, sophisticated astronomical alignments, and evidence of large-scale social organization. This was built by people who lived primarily as hunter-gatherers, though recent evidence suggests they may have practiced early forms of cultivation. The sophistication of the site challenges traditional narratives about the linear progression from simple to complex societies. The temples were deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. Someone went to enormous effort to cover these structures with thousands of tons of dirt, preserving them for the future. Why? Gunung Padang in Indonesia, a massive terraced structure that some researchers argue contains megalithic chambers dating back possibly 20,000 years or more, based on contested geological surveys. Mainstream archaeologists dispute this interpretation, dating the visible construction layers to around 5000 BCE, based on more conventional archaeological evidence. The deeper layers remain a subject of ongoing scientific debate. Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, underwater stone structures featuring right angles, terraces, and what appear to be deliberate cuts. Most geologists argue these are natural rock formations, shaped by erosion and geological processes. Some researchers, however, interpret certain features as potentially artificial. If any portion proves to be human-made, it would have been constructed during the last ice age when sea levels were lower, though this remains highly controversial in the scientific community. These anomalies exist in the margins, dismissed or explained away by mainstream archaeology, perhaps correctly, perhaps not. The point is not that these sites definitively prove advanced Ice Age civilizations. The point is that the possibility exists, the door is open, and ancient cultures around the world seem to be telling us that the door should be open. They are telling us, look backward, look deeper. What you think is the beginning is not the beginning. Now, let's return to the Sumerian king list. Let's take those antediluvian kings seriously for a moment, not as literal individuals, but as epochs, as the ages of civilization. If each king represents not a person, but a man, an interpretation some researchers have proposed, though it's not the mainstream view, and if we compress the timeline to make it more palatable to our modern understanding of history, we get something like this. First era. The Age of Alulim. The Founding Age. The time when kingship descended from heaven. This could represent the very first emergence of organized human society. Small settlements becoming villages, becoming towns. The slow transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to agricultural communities. This process took thousands of years in reality, compressed into the reign of one archetypal king. Second era. The Age of Al-Aljar, consolidation. The first towns becoming small cities, trade networks forming, social hierarchies becoming more complex. Another long epoch of development. Through 8 such eras, each one building on the previous one, civilization grows in complexity, in population, in technical knowledge. Arts flourish, astronomy develops, mathematics, architecture, metallurgy, all slowly advancing over vast stretches of time. And then catastrophe, the flood. Whether literal flood, climate catastrophe, disease, war, or some combination of disasters, the chain breaks. Population collapses. Knowledge is lost. Cities are abandoned. But not everything is lost. Survivors carry fragments forward, stories, techniques, the memory of how things used to be, even if the understanding of why is gone, and so they rebuild. Smaller, younger, starting again, but not from zero, they have seeds from the old world, literal seeds, crop species that took thousands of years to domesticate, and metaphorical seeds, myths, stories, half-remembered technologies. They build Eridu, they build Uruk, they create Sumerian civilization, the first civilization as we know it. But they know, and their records state clearly, that they are not the first. They are the heirs of something older. This pattern, rise, fall, rise again from the ashes, could have repeated not once but multiple times, each cycle leaving fainter traces than the last. Each civilization rising to different heights, falling in different ways, passing on different fragments. If we take the cyclical view seriously, if we accept the pattern encoded in myths worldwide, we arrive at a disturbing possibility. We are not the first advanced civilization on Earth. We might not even be the second or third. We might be the 7th or the 10th or the 70th. Each previous civilization rose as high as it could with the resources and knowledge available, then fell to war, disease, climate change, or some catastrophe we can't imagine. Each left behind traces, stones that puzzled the next civilization, myths that were misunderstood, technologies that were lost and had to be reinvented. And each time the survivors looked at the ruins of what came before and told their children. Once there was a golden age. Once people lived longer, knew more, built greater things. Then came the flood, the fire, the darkness. Now we must rebuild. Let your breathing slow. Let these ideas drift like sediment settling to the bottom of an ancient sea. Whether you believe any of this or not doesn't matter right now. What matters is the possibility, the opening of the door. The temperature drops as evening settles over ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine yourself there, in the scribal school at Nippur, around 1900 BCE. You're an apprentice scribe, perhaps 14 years old. Your fingers are stained with the black ink used for practice on broken pottery shards. But today you've been allowed to approach the master's workspace. He sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a fresh tablet of wet clay before him. This isn't practice, this is sacred work. He's copying the king list, that ancient chronicle that every scribe must preserve exactly, without variation, without error. You watch his stylus move, each wedge pressed with perfect depth and angle, the signs emerging like birds landing on mud. Aen, Lugal, the kingship. The word for descended, a sign that looks like something falling from above. Why? You whisper. Because students may ask questions when the master is in good humour. Why did the first kings live so long? The master doesn't pause in his work. Because time was different then, he says, or because we measure it differently now, or because those weren't kings but ages, or because the gods walked among men and shared their breath. 4 different dancers. All true, none complete. He finishes a line and looks at you. The numbers are sacred, he says. We preserve them because those who came before us preserved them. What they mean, he gestures at the tablet, at the impossible figures. What they mean changes with each generation. But the numbers themselves must not change. Do you understand? You nod, though you don't. Not fully, not yet. The world has ended before, the master says, returning to his work. It will end again. Our task is to preserve, so that when it begins again, something remains. The clay dries. The tablet is fired. It survives 4,000 years, waiting in the earth until German archaeologists uncover it, brush the dirt away, photograph it, catalogue it, interpret it. And still the question remains. What do the numbers mean? Let that question hang in the air as you drift. Feel the weight of clay in your hands. Smell the dust of ancient Nippur. Hear the scratch of the stylus on wet mud. What do the numbers in the Sumerian king list really mean? Scholars have been debating this for over a century. Some argue they're purely symbolic, sacred numbers with no historical basis whatsoever. The Sumerians used a hexadecimal mathematical system, base 60, which gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Many of the reign lengths in the king list are multiples of 60, or of 3600, 60 squared, which the Sumerians called a sar. 1 sar equals 3600, 10 sars equal 36,000. The reign lengths of the antediluvian kings break down into these units with remarkable precision. This suggests the numbers were chosen for their mathematical elegance, not their historical accuracy. Fair enough, but why these particular numbers? Why not just say a very long time, or countless years? Why give precise mathematical values if they're purely symbolic? Another theory suggests the numbers represent something astronomical. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, understood that the Earth was round. The number 25,920, close to several of the king list's reign lengths, is significant because it's approximately the number of years it takes for the Earth's axis to complete one full cycle of precession, the slow wobble that changes which stars are visible from different points on Earth over millennia. If the antediluvian kings' reigns encode astronomical cycles, the king list becomes a kind of cosmic clock, tracking not individual lifespans but the great pictures of the heavens. This would make sense. Ancient peoples often conflated earthly kings with celestial bodies. The pharaohs of Egypt were identified with Horus, the sun god. The emperors of China ruled through the mandate of heaven. Kingship was not just political, it was cosmic, linking human order to universal order. A third interpretation is more literal but adjusted. Perhaps the Sumerians used a different counting system for years, not solar years as we know them, but lunar months, or seasons, or some other unit of time. If we divide the antediluvian reign length by 12, converting years to months, or by 4, converting years to seasons, we get numbers that are still long, but not impossible. King Alulim's 28,800 years becomes 200 years if we're counting months. Still an impossibly long reign for an individual, but plausible for a dynasty. King Al-Jar's 36,000 years becomes 3,000 years, again plausible for a succession of rulers treated as a single lineage. This interpretation assumes that later scribes copying the king list centuries after it was composed forgot what the original time units meant and interpreted them as solar years, creating the impossibly long reigns we see today. But there's a problem with all these rational explanations. They don't account for the pattern. After the flood, the king list continues with more kings, and their reign lengths gradually decrease. Not randomly, not erratically, but in a clear, progressive decline. The first king after the flood, Ge-ur, ruled for 200 years. Still impossibly long by modern standards, but significantly shorter than the 800 of Alulim. As we move through more post-flood dynasties, the reign lengths continue to drop. 900 years. Is 600 years. 400 years. By the time we reach dynasties that we can cross-reference with other historical records, dynasties whose kings left behind inscriptions, whose cities we can excavate and date, the reign lengths have decreased to realistic numbers. Gilgamesh, the famous hero king of Uruk, who may have been a real historical figure, is listed as reigning for 26 years. Still long, but within the realm of possibility if we allow for some exaggeration or if reign includes a period of regency or co-ruling. By the time we reach the dynasties of the early 2nd millennium BCE, the reigns are completely normal. 20 years, 35 years, 11 years human lifespans. This progressive decline mirrors exactly what we see in Genesis with the biblical patriarchs. Adam lived 930 years, Noah lived 950 years. After the flood, Abraham lived 175 years, Moses lived 20 years. By the time of King David, lifespans had normalized to what we recognize as human, and it mirrors the Hindu yugas, where each age sees a decline in human lifespan and virtue. Different cultures, different traditions, same pattern. As if they're all remembering the same essential truth. There was a time when things were different, when people lived longer, or seemed to, when civilization was greater, or seemed to be, and that time ended catastrophically, and what came after was diminished. Imagine being a Sumerian scribe in 900 BCE, copying this ancient text. You know your grandfather lived about 60 years. You know the current king has reigned for maybe 20, but the text in front of you, passed down through generations of scribes, insists that kings once ruled for thousands of years. Do you dismiss it as fantasy? Or do you trust that the ancients knew something, meant something that you don't fully understand, scribe copies it faithfully, preserves the impossible numbers, passes them forward, trusting that future generations will decode the meaning? And here we are, 4,000 years later, still trying to decode it. For those still drifting with me through this ancient labyrinth, remember, you don't need to understand everything. Let the patterns wash over you. Let the numbers resonate like a half-remembered song. What matters is not whether we can prove the antediluvian kings were real in a literal sense. What matters is that the Sumerians believed they were transmitting something true and important, something worth encoding in sacred mathematics and preserving in clay. Now we must speak of the flood itself. Every ancient culture has a flood myth. This statement, while broad, holds substantial truth. Over 200 distinct flood narratives have been documented by anthropologists, with some researchers counting as many as 300 or more from every inhabited continent, from cultures that appear to have had no contact with each other. The details vary, but the core remains constant. The world became wicked, or overpopulated or too noisy. The gods or God or the spirits decided to destroy it with water. One righteous man was warned. He built a boat. He saved his family and animals. The flood came. Everything else perished. The waters receded. The survivors rebuilt. The oldest version we have in writing is from Sumer, the epic of Ziusudra, dating to around 1600 BCE but based on older oral traditions. Ziusudra, a pious king, receives warning from the god Enki that the Council of Gods has decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki tells him to build a boat. Ziusudra survives, along with his family and animals. After 7 days and 7 nights, the flood ends. Ziusudra is granted immortality and taken to dwell in Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world. The same story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the survivor is named Utnapishtim. Same warning, same boat, same result. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, dating to the 18th century BCE, gives more detail. The gods created humans to do labour for them, but humanity multiplied and became too noisy. The god Enlil couldn't sleep because of human commotion. He decided to destroy them, first with plague, then with drought, then finally with flood. But Enki, who had helped create humans, warned one wise man, Atrahasis, and told him to build a boat. The flood came. Atrahasis survived. When the gods realized what they'd done, destroyed their workforce, they regretted it. They decided to limit human population through natural means rather than total destruction, introducing mortality, miscarriage, and celibacy as population controls. These Mesopotamian flood stories appear to be source material for the biblical flood of Noah, written down centuries later. The parallels are striking: the dimensions of the boat, the sending out of birds to find land, the sacrifice offered after the flood. Whether this represents direct literary borrowing or shared cultural memory of actual floods remains debated, but the connections suggest some relationship between the traditions. But here's what should give us pause. The flood myths are global, not regional. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by Vishnu in the form of a fish about a coming deluge. Manu builds a boat, rides out the flood, and becomes the progenitor of the new human race. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest, essentially a boat, and survives with his wife Pyrrha. They land on Mount Parnassus and repopulate the earth by throwing stones that become people. In Norse mythology, the world is born from a flood of blood when the gods kill the primordial giant Ymir. His blood drowns all the frost giants except 2 who survive and repopulate. In China, the story of Gunyu describes a great flood that covered the land. Yu the Great spends decades working to control the waters, digging channels and creating river systems to drain the flood. In Australia, various Aboriginal nations have flood stories. The Kurnai people tell of a time when the sea suddenly rose, flooding coastal areas where people had lived. They say the waters came from the south, driven by a fierce wind. In North America, the Ojibwe tell of a great flood sent to purge the world. A man named Waynaboozhoo survives by floating on a log with various animals. In South America, the Inca preserve stories of a flood that destroyed earlier peoples. The creator god Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca after the flood to create a new world. Why? Why would cultures that never met, separated by oceans and continents, all tell versions of the same story? The standard academic explanation is that floods are a common human experience. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike coasts, violent storms cause localized flooding. Every culture experiences these things, so every culture develops flood mythology. This explanation works for localized myths, but it doesn't quite account for the global extent or for the specific pattern. The world is destroyed, one family survives, civilization begins again. That's not just we had a bad flood once, that's the entire world ended and restarted. There are two main possibilities for why these myths are so universal. The first, their cultural memory of an actual global catastrophe. The most likely candidate is the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose dramatically. This wasn't a sudden deluge, it happened over centuries. But from the perspective of people living through it, watching coastlines disappear, watching islands sink, watching valleys flood as rivers swelled beyond anything previously experienced, it would have felt like the end of the world. And crucially, it was global. Every coastline on Earth was affected, every river system changed, every human population living in lowland areas would have had to migrate inland or to higher ground. If humans had developed any kind of coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, and archaeological evidence is difficult to obtain since coastlines do provide optimal resources for early settlements, those civilizations would have been submerged. Their potential sites now lie under hundreds of feet of water and sediment, largely beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. The survivors would have passed down stories. Once we lived in a great land, then the waters came. We barely escaped. After generations of oral transmission, these stories would have become myths. The actual mechanism, gradual sea level rise, would be compressed into a flood came. The timescale, centuries, would become 7 days and 7 nights, or 40 days and 40 nights. The geographic specificity would be lost, generalized to the whole world, but the core would remain. There was a time before, then came water, then came the time after. The second possibility is independent invention. Humans everywhere experience traumatic floods. Our brains are wired to remember trauma and encode it in story. We're also wired to see patterns, to create narratives that explain our origins and give meaning to suffering. So independently, in India and Mesopotamia and Greece and Australia and Mexico, people created similar flood narratives because they're psychologically and structurally satisfying. They explain why the world is the way it is. They provide a mechanism for cosmic renewal. They reinforce moral codes, be righteous or be destroyed. Both explanations are plausible. Perhaps both are partially true. Perhaps some flood myths stem from actual memory of Ice Age catastrophe, while others are later inventions that borrowed the narrative structure because it resonated. But there's a third possibility, more unsettling, that we should at least consider. What if the flood myths are remembering not one catastrophe, but many? What if catastrophic resets are the norm for human civilization, not the exception? What if every few thousand years something happens, climate shift, disease, war, asteroid impact, volcanic eruption, that collapses whatever civilization has built itself up? And each time survivors tell the story of how the world ended, and they lived. And each time the details change, but the pattern remains. If this is true, then we're not remembering one Ice Age flood. We're remembering a cycle. Rise, peak, collapse, survive, rebuild, and rise again. And the civilizations doing the remembering are not the first. They're the latest in a long series, each one looking back at the ruins of the one before, trying to make sense of what happened, preserving the memory in the only way they know how, through story, through myth, through sacred numbers pressed into clay. If you have drifted away, that's okay. Come back now gently. We're moving into the stranger territory, into the question that might matter most. If there were civilizations before us, if the pattern of rise and fall has repeated multiple times, how many cycles? The Sumerian king list implies at least 2 major cycles, before the flood and after. But if the antediluvian kings represent compressed eras, multiple civilizations could be encoded in those 8 names. The Hindu yugas cycle endlessly, 4 ages repeating. After each Kali Yuga comes destruction, then rebirth into a new Satya Yuga. The texts say we're currently in the Kali Yuga of the current cycle, which began in 3102 BCE and will last 42,000 years. After that, a new cycle begins, but above the Mahayuga, the 4-age cycle, are larger cycles. 1,000 Mahayugas make a kalpa, one day of Brahma, lasting 4.32 billion years. At the end of a kalpa, the universe is destroyed and recreated. The scale is cosmic. The cycles within cycles suggest a universe that breathes, expanding and contracting, creating and destroying endlessly. If we apply this cyclical thinking to human civilization, as some researchers have proposed, though this remains outside mainstream archaeology, a speculative pattern emerges. First civilization. Emerging from hunter-gatherer bands, developing agriculture, building the first permanent settlements. This might correspond to what we call the Neolithic Revolution, beginning around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. Small communities learning to farm, to domesticate animals, to stay in one place. But this civilization is localized. It doesn't spread far. Climate change, disease or conflict causes it to collapse before it can develop beyond a certain point. Second civilization. Survivors rebuild. They have agricultural knowledge now, passed down from their parents. They resettle, this time spreading more widely. Trade networks form between villages. Pottery develops, metallurgy begins. First copper, then bronze. This civilization rises higher than the first. It develops writing, rudimentary mathematics, social hierarchy. But it too falls. War between rival groups, drought, plague. The collapse is regional but devastating. Third civilization. Again, survivors rebuild with the fragments. This time they spread even further. Cities emerge. Different regions develop different cultures, different languages. Empires form and compete. This cycle might correspond to what we think of as the Bronze Age civilizations, the Minoans, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, early Egypt. They traded across the Mediterranean, developed sophisticated arts, built palaces and temples, and around 1200 BCE, they collapsed. Almost simultaneously, the Bronze Age collapse, one of history's great mysteries. Cities burned, trade networks shattered, writing systems were forgotten, population declined dramatically. The survivors called the destroyers the Sea Peoples. But who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they destroy everything? We don't know. We only know that after the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world entered a dark age lasting several centuries. When civilization re-emerged, it was different. Iron instead of bronze, new languages, new cultures. Greece, Phoenicia, Israel, arising from the ashes of what came before. Fourth civilization, the Iron Age, the classical world. Greece, Rome, Persia, India, China. This is the civilization we think we know. Philosophy, literature, engineering on a grand scale. Empires spanning continents. And then it too declined. Rome fell. The Gupta Empire collapsed. The Classical Age ended, and medieval Dark Ages began in Europe, though civilization continued elsewhere, in the Islamic world, in China, in Mesoamerica. Fifth civilization, the medieval period through the Renaissance. Slow rebuilding, universities, printing press, ocean exploration, science beginning to systematize. Sixth civilization, the Industrial Revolution through modernity. Explosive growth, fossil fuels, electronics, atomic energy. Spaceflight, the internet. Us, right now, thinking we're at the pinnacle, that we've broken the cycle, that we understand enough to avoid collapse. But maybe we're just at the peak of the sixth civilization, and the seventh is yet to come. Or maybe we're already the seventh, if we count differently. Maybe the Dark Ages were longer than we think, and medieval Europe was already rebuilding from a more complete collapse. The numbering doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern. What if history is not linear but spiral? Each civilization climbing higher than the last, but on the same path, facing the same challenges, making the same mistakes. What if the Sumerian king list, the Hindu yugas, the Greek ages, the flood myths, what if they're all trying to tell us the same thing? You are not the first, you are not unique. This has happened before, it will happen again, unless you learn, unless you remember, unless you break the cycle. Your eyes are heavy now, your breathing has slowed. The ancient world feels very close and very far away. What would it mean for us, right now in our moment, if we took the cyclical view seriously? It would mean we're not on an inevitable march of progress. It would mean that everything we've built, cities, technologies, institutions, knowledge, is fragile, temporary, subject to collapse like everything before it. This is either terrifying or liberating, depending on your perspective. Terrifying because it means our civilization could end. Not might end, could end, has ended before, will end again. All our works, all our achievements, potentially lost to time, preserved only as fragments, as myths that future civilizations will barely understand, liberating because it removes the burden of permanence. We don't have to build forever. We don't have to achieve immortality. We only have to do what every civilization does, rise as high as we can, preserve what we can, pass forward what we're able, and trust that the cycle will continue, without us. Ancient peoples understood this. They built for the ages, yes. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the megalithic temples, these were built to last. But they also knew impermanence. They encoded their most important knowledge not just in stone, which could be destroyed, but in story, which could survive in human memory even when all physical traces were gone. The flood myths themselves are a form of preservation. They say, pay attention. This happened before, it destroyed everything. But some survived. And because they survived, you exist now. And because you exist, you can survive the next time. Learn to build boats, learn to preserve seeds, learn to remember the important things, not the names of kings, not the boundaries of empires, but the patterns, the cycles, the knowledge that everything rises and falls and rises again. Modern archaeology is beginning reluctantly to acknowledge that the neat timelines we've constructed might be oversimplified. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe forced a reconsideration of when humans first built monumental architecture. We thought it required agriculture, settled life, social surplus. But Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. They organised, they quarried stone, they carved intricate symbols, they created sacred space, all before they farmed. Why? What motivated them? And what else did they do that we haven't found yet? The underwater archaeology off the coast of India has revealed structures that some researchers date to 9,000 years ago or earlier. Submerged cities, or natural formations that look like cities. The debate continues. In the Amazon, LiDAR technology is revealing vast networks of settlements hidden beneath the rainforest canopy. What we thought was pristine wilderness turns out to be a landscape modified by pre-Columbian peoples on a scale we never imagined. Our picture of the past keeps changing, keep expanding. Every few years, some discovery pushes back the timeline of when humans first did X, when we first made art, when we first made tools, when we first buried our dead, when we first domesticated wolves into dogs. We keep finding that humans were sophisticated earlier than we thought, which raises the question, how much earlier? If we've been behaviourally modern for 50,000 years, and we only have archaeological evidence for complex civilization going back 10,000 years, what happened in the other 40,000? Were we really just wandering around, barely surviving for 4 times as long as all of recorded history? Or did we build things, learn things, create things that were lost, that were erased by the flood, by time, by the simple fact that most of what humans make decays and returns to Earth? Wood rots, cloth disintegrates, leather decays, bone turns to dust, even stone crumbles eventually. After 10,000 years, very little remains. After 20,000, almost nothing. If there was a civilization 30,000 years ago, we would find almost no trace of it unless they built in stone on a massive scale. And even then, we might mistake their ruins for natural formations. The past is not a book we can read. It's a whisper we can barely hear, distorted by millennia of noise. Close your eyes fully now if you haven't already. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become the darkness of deep time. Imagine the Earth from space rotating slowly, one rotation every 24 hours. Speed it up, 1 rotation per second. Watch the continents drift. Watch the ice sheets advance and retreat. Watch coastlines rise and fall. Somewhere down there, on those shifting continents, humans are living, building, creating, dying, being born. Zoom in, slow down. A settlement appears, first a few huts, then more, then stone buildings, walls, temples, a city. Watch it thrive for a few hundred years. Trade caravans coming and going, fields of grain surrounding it, people living their lives completely unaware they are part of a cycle. Then something happens, too fast to see exactly. What? Climate shifts, invasion, plague, fire. The city empties, the buildings collapse, sand covers them, or vegetation or water. Within 1,000 years, barely a trace remains. Speed up time again, watch it happen again, different, please. Different time, same pattern. Rise, fall, silence, over and over and over across the millennia. We are watching the breathing of civilization itself. Inhale, exhale, let your breath a little different, and each cycle reaching slightly higher, or lasting slightly longer, or preserving slightly more, but the pattern holds. And here we are now, in our moment, in our civilization, thinking we've finally broken free, that we've achieved escape velocity, that will continue rising forever. But the earth keeps turning, the cycles keep cycling, and the ancient tablets, buried in museums, keep whispering their warning. This has happened before. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it down, preserved it in clay, passed it forward, not as a prophecy of doom, but as a fact of existence, as a truth too important to forget. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, survivors remember, life continues, and perhaps, just perhaps, each cycle preserves a little more than the last. Each civilization passes forward a little more knowledge. Each collapse teaches the survivors something new about resilience. If this is true, then we are not doomed to endless repetition. We are spiraling upward, slowly, painfully, but upward nonetheless. The first civilization learned to farm. The second civilization learned to write. The third civilization learned to build in stone. The fourth civilization learned to work metal. The fifth civilization learned to preserve knowledge across dark ages. The sixth civilization, our civilization, learned to industrialize, to digitize, to spread information globally in ways that might survive even a catastrophic collapse. And the seventh civilization, whatever and whenever it might be, will inherit all of this, all our knowledge, encoded in a million different ways, waiting to be rediscovered. That is, if we do our job, if we preserve what matters, if we pass forward not just technology, but wisdom. Now let us explore the mechanics of collapse, the physical processes that could reset civilization and leave us starting over. Picture the Earth from above, from the perspective of the International Space Station. That fragile blue marble, swirled with white clouds spinning against the darkness. Beautiful, peaceful, eternal it seems, but zoom in closer. Look at the scars, the impact craters, though most are ancient and eroded. The volcanic calderas, some sleeping, some merely dormant. The fault lines spider-webbing across continents, grinding slowly, building pressure. The Earth is not peaceful, it's dynamic, violent on geological timescales, capable of reshaping itself in ways that make human civilization seem like morning frost that evaporates when the sun rises. Consider the Toba super-eruption approximately 74,000 years ago. Mount Toba in Sumatra exploded with a force equivalent to several thousand nuclear weapons. It ejected 800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock into the atmosphere. The volcanic winter that followed may have lasted 6 to 10 years. Global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Genetic studies suggest the human population may have crashed during this period. Some researchers propose it fell to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals worldwide, though this population bottleneck theory remains debated among geneticists. Whether the bottleneck was this severe or more modest, the event would have been catastrophic for any existing human cultures. If humans had developed any sophisticated culture before Toba, complex societies, early agriculture, proto-cities, it would have been obliterated. The few survivors scattered in small bands would have had to rebuild everything from basic survival, and all memory of what came before would become myth. Once our ancestors lived in great settlements, then the sky darkened and winter never ended, only a few families survived. After generations of oral transmission, this becomes, the gods were angry and destroyed the world with darkness and cold. The specific mechanism, supervolcano, is lost, but the pattern remains. There was a before, there was destruction, there is now. Toba erupted 4,000 years ago, long before any civilization we recognize, but supervolcanoes erupt on cycles measured in hundreds of thousands of years. Yellowstone erupts roughly every 100,000 to 100,000 years. The last eruption was 640,000 years ago. We're approaching another cycle. If Yellowstone erupted today, with the force of its previous eruptions, it would bury much of the North American Midwest under several feet of ash. Crops would fail. Livestock would die. Respiratory diseases would spike. The ash cloud would circle the globe within weeks, dimming sunlight, dropping temperatures worldwide. Modern civilization, with its global supply chains, its dependence on industrial agriculture, its concentrated populations in cities, we're more vulnerable to catastrophic disruption than any previous society. Within months, food shortages would trigger conflicts. Governments would struggle to maintain order. Power grids would fail as coal plants clogged with ash. The internet, that repository of all our knowledge, depends on electrical power and functional servers. If the catastrophe lasted long enough, say 5 to 10 years of volcanic winter, much of our infrastructure would collapse. Billions would die. The survivors would be scattered, isolated, forced back to subsistence living. And after a few generations, after the volcanic winter ended and the scattered survivors began to rebuild, what would they remember? They would remember the time before the darkness, when machines flew through the air, when food came from stores, not hunting and gathering, when humans could speak to each other across vast distances through glowing screens. They would tell their children about the old world, and their children would tell their children. And after 10 generations, after 20, the stories would have shifted. The machines that flew would become metal birds, perhaps, or chariots of the gods. The glowing screens would become magical seeing stones. The old world would become a golden age when giants or gods or ancestors with great powers walked the earth. Eventually someone would write it down and someone else would read it thousands of years later and say, these are just myths, exaggerations, symbols. They didn't mean these things literally. And the memory of our civilization would become what the Sumerian king list has become to us. A mysterious text with impossible claims preserved because it feels important but no longer fully understood. This is how knowledge is lost. Not all at once in a dramatic burning of the libraries, but gradually through disruption, through generational drift, through the simple fact that oral tradition distorts over time. But some things survive. Patterns survive. The knowledge that there was a before and a catastrophe and a rebuilding. The awareness that this has happened before and might happen again. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. You're safe right now in this moment. The catastrophes we're discussing are possibilities, not certainties. Distant thunder, not present storms. Let's consider another mechanism of collapse. Climate shifts. The Earth's climate is not stable. It oscillates between ice ages and interglacial periods on cycles of roughly 100,000 years, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, the Milankovitch cycles. For the past 11,700 years, we've been in an interglacial period called the Holocene. Stable climate, moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for civilization to develop. But the Holocene won't last forever. At some point, perhaps thousands of years from now, perhaps sooner if we've disrupted the climate system beyond some tipping point, the ice will return, or the opposite might happen, runaway warming, making large parts of the Earth uninhabitable. Either scenario would force massive human migration, climate refugees by the billions, competition for remaining habitable land and resources, wars, famines, plagues following in the wake of weakened, malnourished populations. Civilizations have collapsed from climate shifts far less dramatic than a full glacial transition. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC coincided with a period of drought in the eastern Mediterranean. Cities dependent on agriculture in marginal lands simply couldn't sustain their populations. Trade networks broke down. Complex societies fragmented into smaller, simpler ones. The classic Maya collapse around 900 CE corresponded with an extended drought in the Yucatan. Great cities like Tikal and Copan were abandoned. The population crashed. The survivors reverted to village-level organization. The Western Roman Empire declined during a period of cooling and plague. The medieval warm period, 950 to 1250 CE, saw European civilization flourish. The Little Ice Age, 1300 to 1850 CE, brought famines, political instability, and the Black Death. Climate shapes civilization, and climate changes with or without human influence. Now imagine a worst-case scenario, multiple stressors converging, a supervolcanic eruption triggering climate disruption, pandemic disease spreading through weakened populations, agricultural failure leading to conflict and war, electromagnetic solar storm destroying electrical infrastructure, asteroid impact, small enough not to cause extinction but large enough to devastate a continent. Any one of these could severely damage modern civilization. several happening in sequence or simultaneously could cause total collapse. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We have historical and geological evidence that such convergences have happened before. Around 536 from 540 CE, something catastrophic occurred. Tree ring data shows extreme climate anomaly, the worst in 2,000 years. Historical accounts from Rome, Constantinople, China describe the sun dimming, crops failing, a year without summer. This coincided with the plague of Justinian, which killed up to half the population of the Mediterranean world. What caused the 536 event? Possibly volcanic eruption, possibly asteroid or comet impact, possibly both. We're still not certain, but the effects were clear. The classical world, already in decline, was pushed over the edge. The Dark Ages deepened. Knowledge was lost. Population collapsed. It took centuries to recover. And that was a relatively minor catastrophe by geological standards. Earth has experienced far worse. The Younger Dryas event, 12,900 years ago, saw global temperatures plunge suddenly, returning to near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The cause remains debated among scientists. Some evidence has been interpreted to suggest meteor impacts over North America, triggering massive wildfires and climate disruption, though this hypothesis is contested. Other researchers point to disruption of ocean currents or volcanic activity. Whatever the trigger, the climate shift was dramatic and global. Either way, any human cultures existing at that time would have been devastated. And this was right at the end of the last ice age, right when sea levels were beginning to rise, drowning coastal settlements. If there were sophisticated human societies 10,000 years ago, not necessarily civilizations with writing and cities as we define them, but complex hunter-gatherer cultures with extensive knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and architecture, the Younger Dryas would have devastated them. This remains speculative, as we lack direct archaeological evidence, but the scenario helps explain certain patterns in global mythology. The survivors would have scattered, their knowledge would have fragmented, and after 1,000 years of climate chaos, when stable conditions finally returned and the Holocene began, the descendants would start rebuilding. With fragments, with memories, with what could have become myths of the ancestors who knew the secrets of the stars and built in stone before the world ended. Myths like those preserved in the Sumerian king list, like the Hindu yugas, like flood stories worldwide. Whether these are cultural memories of actual events or independent, psychological constructions remains debated. Some researchers interpret them as memories encoded in the only format that survives catastrophe: human narrative, passed generation to generation, slowly transforming from history to myth but retaining essential patterns. Others see them as universal human responses to common experiences: floods, natural disasters, generational decline, projected onto cosmic timescales. The evidence supports elements of both views. Close your eyes if they're still open. Let these possibilities settle like dust after a storm. You don't need to remember all the details, just the pattern. Just the awareness that the Earth is dynamic, that climate shifts, that catastrophes happen, that civilizations are more fragile than we like to believe. And yet life continues. Humans survive. We're remarkably resilient, adaptable, innovative when necessity demands it. The question is not whether catastrophe will come again. Geological and astronomical certainty says it will eventually. The question is what we preserve, what we pass forward, what we encode for the survivors to find. Let your breath deepen. Feel yourself sinking into sleep, into the dreams, into the timeless space where past and future collapse into the eternal present. The difference between technology and wisdom is crucial. Technology is how we do things. Wisdom is knowing which things are worth doing. We've excelled at technology. We've built machines that can think, that can fly to other planets, that can map the human genome. But wisdom, the knowledge of how to live in balance, how to avoid the cycles of empire and collapse, how to sustain rather than consume, that's harder. That's the lesson every previous civilization failed to fully learn. Maybe that's why they fell. Not because they lacked technology, but because they lacked wisdom. Yet before we move toward our closing, let us examine more closely what the ancient world tried to preserve and how they preserved it, because this might teach us what we should preserve for those who come after us. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, massive stone structures designed to last forever, and they have lasted, relatively speaking, 4,500 years and counting. But what knowledge do the pyramids preserve? Not writing primarily. The earliest pyramids contain no texts. The later ones have hieroglyphic inscriptions, but these are religious formulas, spells for the afterlife. Instructions for the soul's journey, not for building civilization. The pyramids preserve knowledge through form, through mathematical ratios, through astronomical alignments, through engineering principles embedded in stone. The Great Pyramid's dimensions have been analysed for mathematical relationships. Some researchers argue they encode the constant pi, while others attribute such relationships to coincidence or selective measurement. Its sides align precisely to the cardinal directions, this is verified. Its shafts point towards specific stars as they would have appeared in the Pyramid Age, also documented. Whether these alignments were intentional repositories of knowledge or served purely ceremonial purposes remains a matter of interpretation. But consider, if you wanted to preserve knowledge for a civilization 10,000 years in the future, a civilization that might not speak your language, might not even have writing, how would you do it? You couldn't use books, paper decays, even stone tablets can be destroyed, burned, ground to powder for construction material. But you could build something massive, unmistakable, aligned to astronomical constants that don't change. You could encode mathematical ratios in the structure itself. Anyone with mathematics in any era would recognize pi, phi, the square root of 2. You could build it in stone that would last tens of thousands of years. And you could make it so obviously artificial, so clearly designed with intention, that future civilizations would study it, measure it, try to understand what the builders knew. This is knowledge preservation through monument. It's not efficient. Most of the knowledge is lost. But the key ratios, the astronomical alignments, the evidence that someone built this with sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge, that survives. The megaliths of Europe, Stonehenge, Karnak, Newgrange, serve similar functions. Astronomical observatories built in stone, calendars designed to track solstices and equinoxes, knowledge preserved through alignment. Newgrange in Ireland is 200 years old, older than the Great Pyramid. Once a year on winter solstice, sunlight penetrates through a carefully designed roof box and illuminates the inner chamber. For 17 minutes, light floods a space that's otherwise dark year-round. This is knowledge preservation. The sun returns, the days will lengthen again, life continues. Even if every word of the builders' language was lost, even if their entire civilization collapsed and their descendants forgot who built Newgrange or why, the light would still come on winter solstice and people would gather. And remember, the Inca preserved knowledge through quipu, knotted strings that encoded numbers and possibly phonetic information. Most quipu knowledge was lost when the Spanish destroyed them as pagan objects, but the concept survived, along with fragments of how to read them. The Aboriginal Australians preserved knowledge through songlines, oral traditions linking stories to landscapes. Walk the land, sing the song, remember the law. This system preserved detailed environmental knowledge for over 40,000 years, far longer than any written tradition. The method adapted perfectly to Australia's ecology. In a continent prone to wildfires, where physical structures decay quickly, where populations were nomadic, writing on fragile materials wouldn't have survived. But songs, stories, dances, these could be carried in human memory, practiced regularly, taught to each generation. And the stories encode practical knowledge, where water sources are, which plants are edible, when animals migrate, how to navigate vast distances using stars and landforms. This is wisdom preservation through culture, through practice, through making knowledge sacred, so that forgetting it would be not just impractical but blasphemous. Perhaps the Sumerian king list served this function. It's not a practical document. Knowing that Alalim ruled for 28,800 years doesn't help you plant crops or navigate rivers or cast bronze. But copying it, preserving it, teaching young scribes to memorize it, this keeps scribal traditions alive. It preserves the concept that there was a deep past, that time extends far beyond living memory, that the world has changed and might change again. It preserves historical consciousness, the awareness that we are part of something larger than ourselves, larger than our city, larger than our generation. And historical consciousness is the foundation of civilization. Without it, you're trapped in the eternal present. You can't learn from the past or plan for the future. The king list says, you're part of a long chain. Others came before you. Others will come after you. Your actions matter beyond your lifetime. This is wisdom disguised as mythology, truth encoded in impossible numbers. Now think about what our civilization is preserving. What will survive us? Our digital records, billions of texts, images, videos containing effectively all human knowledge, depend on electrical power and functional computers. If both were lost simultaneously, the vast majority of our information would become inaccessible within a human lifetime. Hard drives degrade, SSDs lose charge, magnetic tape deteriorates, optical discs delaminate. Even archival quality storage media might last a few hundred years, not thousands. And even if the storage media survived, you'd need compatible hardware and software to read them. The digital dark age is a real concern among archivists. Files from the 1980s are already becoming difficult to access because the hardware and software to read them no longer exist. So what will survive a major collapse of our civilization? Stone if we carve it, ceramics if we fire them, glass if we make it thick enough, metal if we alloy it correctly, but we don't encode much knowledge in these durable media anymore. The Georgia Guidestones, built in 1980, attempted this. Massive granite slabs inscribed with messages in 8 languages about how to rebuild civilization, maintain population below 500 million, guide reproduction wisely, unite humanity with a living new language, etc. Controversial messages, certainly, and the Guidestones were actually destroyed in 22, but the concept was sound. Encode important principles in durable stone in multiple languages in a location where they might be found. We've sent messages into space, the Voyager golden records carrying images and sounds representing Earth. These might survive billions of years in the vacuum of space. If anything finds them, they'll know we existed, know some of what we knew, hear our music, but for preserving knowledge for future human civilizations on Earth, we need something more accessible than spacecraft billions of miles away. Some scientists have proposed the Memory of Mankind project, storing information on ceramic tablets that could last millions of years. Others suggest encoding data in synthetic DNA, which can remain stable for thousands of years and stores vast amounts of information in tiny physical space. The Long Now Foundation is building a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, preserving the concept of deep time, encouraging long-term thinking. These are good ideas, noble efforts, but they're tiny projects compared to the scale of human knowledge and the magnitude of potential collapse. What will really survive, probably, is the same thing that always survives: stories. Skills passed hand to hand, the knowledge encoded in the genes of our domesticated plants and animals, the modified landscape itself. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, the survivors would still have wheat and rice and corn, crops that took thousands of years to domesticate and can't survive in the wild without human cultivation. They'd have dogs and cats and chickens and cattle, species shaped by millennia of selective breeding. They'd have ruins. Concrete structures might last thousands of years, slowly eroding but clearly artificial. Future archaeologists would excavate them the way we excavate Sumerian cities. They'd have metals. Bronze and iron tools might corrode, but brass and stainless steel could survive indefinitely. Gold certainly would. Any surviving gold objects would be recognized as artificial, proof of prior metallurgical knowledge. They'd have stories, oral traditions about the before times, when humans flew through the air and talked across great distances and lived in cities of glass and light. And after enough generations, those stories would become myths. The flying machines would become metal birds or chariots of the gods. The glass cities would become the halls of immortals. The technology would become magic. And someone eventually would write it down, create a new king list, a new chronicle of impossible wonders before the flood. The cycle would continue, unless we do something different, unless we consciously choose to preserve not just technology but wisdom, not just information but understanding. What wisdom should we preserve? The laws of thermodynamics, the germ theory of disease, the principles of crop rotation and sustainable agriculture, the knowledge that cooperation and trade create more prosperity than conquest and empire, the awareness that resources are finite, that population growth can't continue indefinitely, that short-term thinking leads to long-term collapse, the pattern of the cycles themselves, the recognition that civilizations rise and fall, that hubris precedes catastrophe, that balance is more sustainable than endless growth. These truths, if encoded properly, could help the next civilization avoid our mistakes. But how do you encode wisdom? Facts are easy. You can write them down. But wisdom requires understanding, context, the ability to apply principles to new situations. Maybe wisdom can't be preserved in texts or monuments. Maybe it can only be preserved through living traditions, through cultures that embody sustainable principles, through education systems that teach not just what to think but how to think, through myths and stories that encode truths in forms memorable enough to survive oral transmission. Perhaps that's why every culture developed mythology, why the Sumerians encoded their king list with impossible numbers that force you to think metaphorically, to seek deeper meaning. The numbers can't be literal, so you must interpret them. And in interpreting them, you engage with the deeper question. What were they trying to preserve? Maybe the answer is simply this: the awareness that there was a before, that the world has changed, that nothing is permanent, that we should build with future generations in mind. That awareness, that historical consciousness, that long-term thinking, these might be the most important things to preserve. Because a civilization that thinks only of the present will make choices that mortgage the future, will consume resources unsustainably, will grow beyond its carrying capacity, will collapse. But a civilization that remembers the past, that thinks in generations rather than quarters, that sees itself as part of a long chain, that civilization has a chance to break the cycle, to build differently, to think differently, to be the one that survives not just by luck but by wisdom. Let these thoughts dissolve now like salt in water, present but not overwhelming. Your breathing has slowed, your body has grown heavy, the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin. In this liminal space, in this threshold between consciousness and dream, the ancient world feels very close. The scribes of Nipper are still working, their styluses scratching on wet clay. The stones of the pyramids are still being placed, hauled up or ramps that will leave no trace. The stars still wheel overhead, tracking the same patterns they've traced for billions of years. And somewhere in that vastness, in that deep time, we are a single breath. Our civilization, our moment, our choices, a single inhalation in the long breathing of the world. What will we exhale? What will we pass forward? That's the question the Sumerian king list asks. That's what the myths of the flood, the yugas, the ages of man all whisper through the centuries. You are temporary, but what you build can endure. Not the buildings, perhaps, not the machines, but the ideas, the principles, the patterns, the awareness that civilizations rise and fall like tides. But knowledge can survive if we encode it well, if we preserve it wisely, if we teach our children to remember even what they don't understand, so they can pass it to their children and their children's children, until some distant age when the meaning becomes clear again, when the cycle turns, when humanity rises once more from whatever flood has swept over us. The Hindu texts say that in Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, humans lived for thousands of years not because of medicine or technology, but because of dharma, righteousness, cosmic order, living in harmony with universal law. In Kali Yuga, our age, lifespans are short because dharma has declined. We've forgotten the cosmic order. We think we can conquer nature, instead of cooperating with it. The Sumerians built a civilization in a harsh desert by learning to cooperate with water, to channel it, to share it. But eventually their irrigation systems salinized the soil, they depleted the land that sustained them, and their civilization collapsed. The Maya built great cities in the rainforest, but their agricultural practices deforested vast areas. When drought came, they had no buffer. The cities emptied. Rome conquered half the known world, but exhausted its political and economic systems in the process. The empire became too large, too complex, too corrupt to sustain itself. Every fallen civilization fell for different specific reasons, but they all share a common pattern. They exceeded their ability to maintain themselves. They grew faster than they could adapt. They consumed more than they could renew. And now we are doing the same, on a global scale. We've built a civilization powered by burning ancient carbon, coal, oil, gas, releasing, in 2 centuries, the stored sunlight of millions of years. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, the acidity of the oceans, the stability of the climate. We know this, the science is clear, we're conducting an experiment on the only planet we have, and we don't know how it will end. Are we the civilization that finally breaks the cycle? Or are we about to become another layer in the archaeological record, another cautionary tale for whoever comes after? The answer depends on choices we make now, whether we recognize the patterns, whether we learn from history, whether we choose wisdom over mere technology, whether we preserve what matters most, not just for ourselves, not just for our children, but for the 7th civilization, or the 8th, or the 100th. For whoever inherits the earth after we're gone, they will dig in the ruins of our cities. They will find our metals, our plastics, our modified landscape. They will wonder who we were and what we knew. And if we've done our job, they'll find something else, something durable, something that survived the flood, whatever form that flood takes. Maybe a monument with astronomical alignments and mathematical constants. Maybe ceramic tablets with essential knowledge. Maybe DNA sequences encoding our genome and our domesticated species. Maybe just stories, passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, slowly mythologized but retaining the essential truth. There was a civilization before. They flew through the air. They spoke across distances. They built cities of light. They knew many things, and then they fell. The flood came, the climate changed, the systems collapsed, but some survived. And they left us seeds, knowledge, patterns, so we could rebuild, so we could rise again, so we could learn from their mistakes, so we could, perhaps, break the cycle. That's the message encoded in the Sumerian king list, in the myths of the flood, in the concept of cyclical time. Not you're doomed to repeat forever, but the cycle continues and each time you have another chance. Each civilization that rises from the ashes of the one before has the opportunity to learn from what came before, to make different choices, to build differently, to prioritize differently. We have more tools for learning than any previous civilization. We can read Sumerian, we can excavate ancient cities, we can analyze pollen cores and ice cores and see exactly how past climates changed. We can study the rise and fall of empires across continents and centuries. We can see the patterns. And seeing the patterns, maybe we can choose differently. Not to build higher necessarily, not to conquer more, not to consume faster, but to build more wisely, to cooperate more effectively, to preserve more carefully, to think not just about the next quarter, the next election, the next generation, but about the next cycle. What will we pass forward? What will survive us? Not our buildings, not our banks, not our borders, but our knowledge, our stories, our understanding of how the world works and what it means to be human. That's what the Sumerians gave us. Clay tablets that survived 4,000 years because they encoded something true and important. What are we encoding? What medium will survive the next 4,000 years? Digital storage decays, hard drives fail, formats become obsolete. Our knowledge is stored in media more fragile than clay. Maybe we need to think like the ancients. Encode the most important things in stone, in story, in patterns so fundamental they can be recognized by any intelligent being regardless of language or culture. The mathematical constants of the universe, the structure of DNA, the periodic table, the basic facts of cosmology, and alongside the science, the wisdom, the stories that teach how to live, how to cooperate, how to survive catastrophe. These things, if preserved well enough, could survive a collapse, could be rediscovered by the next civilization, could help them avoid our mistakes. That would be our gift to the 7th civilization, or the 8th, or the 10th. Not technology they'd have to rediscover anyway, but wisdom they might not learn on their own. The understanding that civilizations are temporary, that the earth endures, that cooperation is survival, that hubris leads to fall. These are old truths, the Sumerians knew them. Every ancient culture knew them. We've forgotten them in our rush to grow, to expand, to progress. But the clay tablets remember. The myths remember. The patterns remember. And if we listen, if we pay attention to what the ancients tried to tell us, maybe we can remember too. Let the last thoughts drift away now like smoke from an ancient hearth, rising into the night sky, dissipating into stars. But before we rest, before we release consciousness into sleep, let us visit one more place, one more fragment of the pattern. Imagine yourself standing on the Giza Plateau in Egypt before the Great Pyramid, not in the daylight when tourists crowd the site, but at night, under stars that have watched this monument for 4,500 years. The pyramid rises. Before you, a mountain made by human hands. 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing over 80 tons, fitted so precisely that you can't slide a razor blade between many of the stones. aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. For centuries, this was the tallest structure on Earth. A marvel of engineering that we could replicate today, yes, but with enormous effort and modern machinery. Cranes, computers, advanced mathematics. And yet the ancient Egyptians built this with copper and bronze tools, wooden rollers and rope, techniques well documented in archaeological evidence from the period. In about 20 years, according to the conventional chronology during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2560 BCE. The methods are understood, though the logistics remain staggering. The standard explanation is human ingenuity combined with massive labour, possibly 100,000 workers rotating in shifts, quarrying stone from upstream, floating it down the Nile, dragging it up ramps, positioning each block with extraordinary precision. This is plausible. Difficult, but plausible. Humans are capable of remarkable feats when organised and motivated. But stand there at night, place your hand on the ancient stone, feel the weight of it, the precision of it, the sheer audacity of it, and ask yourself, why? Why build something so massive, so precise, so extensive in the human labour and resources? The standard answer is tomb for the pharaoh. But Khufu's burial chamber is small, simple, undexterrated. No treasure was found, no body definitively identified as Khufu. For a monument that represents decades of work by tens of thousands of people, it seems oddly empty. What if the pyramid's purpose wasn't burial? What if it was preservation? Some researchers suggest the Great Pyramid was designed to encode knowledge. When measured in certain ways, ratios approximating pi can be derived from its dimensions, though scholars debate whether this reflects intentionals, encoding or emerges from the geometric properties of the structure itself. The passages do align to specific stars. The structure's proportions have been interpreted by some as a map of the Earth's dimensions at various scales, though these interpretations remain contested in Egyptology. If you wanted to preserve the knowledge that the Earth is a sphere and encode its approximate dimensions in a structure that would last tens of thousands of years, you might build something exactly like the Great Pyramid. And perhaps more importantly, you'd make it so obviously artificial, so clearly designed with intention and sophisticated knowledge, that any future civilization would study it, measure it, try to understand what the builders knew. Even if your language was lost, even if your civilization collapsed, even if every scrap of writing decayed to dust, the monument would remain, silent, patient, waiting for someone intelligent enough to decode it. This is one theory. Mainstream Egyptology rejects it, pointing to evidence that the pyramids were indeed tombs, part of elaborate funerary complexes with temples and causeway and subsidiary pyramids. But both can be true. A monument can serve multiple purposes. It can be a tomb and a temple, and an encoded message to the future all at once. The point is not to prove that the pyramids were built by anyone other than the ancient Egyptians. The point is to recognise that the ancient Egyptians were far more sophisticated than we sometimes give them credit for. They thought in deep time. They built for eternity. They understood that their civilization might not last forever, but stone would. And they weren't alone. Around the world, ancient cultures built monuments that seemed designed to outlast their civilizations: Stonehenge, the megaliths of Karnak, the temples of Malta, the Nazca Lines, the statues of Easter Island. Each one represents an enormous investment of labour and resources. Each one seems calibrated to endure. And each one preserves knowledge, astronomical alignments, geometric principles, evidence of sophisticated surveying and construction techniques. Were these merely religious sites? Certainly. Were they also attempts to preserve knowledge for the future? Possibly. The line between sacred and practical blurs in ancient cultures. A site that tracks the solstices serves both religious and agricultural functions. A monument that encodes the mathematical constant pi might be both a spiritual symbol and a mathematical lesson. Perhaps the ancients didn't separate these categories the way we do. For them, knowledge of the cosmos was sacred knowledge. Mathematics was divine. Astronomy was theology. Building a monument that preserved this knowledge was an act of worship and an act of preservation, inseparable. And if that interpretation holds, then these monuments around the world, built by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, with no clear evidence of contact, might represent parallel developments, different cultures independently encoding knowledge, or preserving patterns passed from a common source. The archaeological evidence doesn't definitively resolve this question. We were here. We knew these things. We understood the cosmos. Remember us. Learn from us. Now, Shift your perspective. Move forward in time from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe. The great cathedrals rise, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, massive stone structures that took generations to build, flying buttresses, soaring vaults, stained glass windows containing colours we still don't fully understand how they achieved. The standard narrative says these were built for the glory of God, to inspire awe, to lift the human spirit toward heaven. True, but they also preserved knowledge. The stained glass windows often depicted stories from the Bible, yes, but also zodiac symbols, mathematical patterns, alchemical imagery. The architecture itself encoded geometric principles, the golden ratio, sacred geometry, harmonic proportions. The medieval guilds who built these cathedrals guarded their knowledge jealously. Master masons passed techniques to apprentices through secret signs and symbols, often not written down. The knowledge was too valuable to be widely shared, but it was encoded in the buildings themselves. Anyone who studied cathedral architecture carefully could reverse engineer the principles, the proportions, the load-bearing structures, the geometry. It was all there, preserved in stone. And when this sin, Black Death, came, when plague killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the 14th century, when economic collapse and social upheaval followed, the cathedrals stood. Knowledge was lost. Entire guilds died out. Techniques were forgotten. But the buildings remained, and later generations studied them, measured them, learned from them, rebuilt what had been lost. The cathedrals were knowledge preservation, whether consciously intended that way or not. They bridged the Dark Ages, keeping geometric and architectural knowledge alive through the worst demographic catastrophe Europe had experienced. This is the pattern. In every cycle, some physical structures survive the collapse, and the structures contain knowledge encoded in their form if not in explicit texts. After Rome fell, aqueducts remained. Later engineers studied them, learned how the Romans managed water flow, rebuilt as similar systems. After the Bronze Age collapse, megalithic structures remained. The people of the Iron Age didn't know who built them, but they knew those builders possessed knowledge worth studying. After our civilization falls, if it falls, what will remain? Our concrete and steel structures will slowly decay, but some will last thousands of years. Future archaeologists will excavate them and learn that we understood chemistry, cement, metallurgy, steel, electricity, power grids, and information technology, the ruins of data centers, even if the data itself is lost. They'll find evidence of our transportation networks, roads, bridges, tunnels, our water systems, our mines and quarries. They'll find plastic, that nearly indestructible testament to our petroleum age. Archaeologists 10,000 years from now will be able to identify the plastic era as a distinct archaeological layer, just as we identify the Bronze Age and Iron Age. And if we're wise, we'll also leave something intentional, something designed to be found and understood. Not just monuments to our glory, but messages to the future, knowledge encoded in durable media, warnings about what led to our collapse, advice for building more sustainably. The challenge is doing this in a way that transcends language and culture. We don't know what languages the seventh civilization will speak. We don't know what symbols will be meaningful to them. But certain things are universal. Mathematical constants, astronomical alignments, the structure of atoms and the periodic table, the double helix of DNA. If we encode these things, perhaps on ceramic tablets, perhaps in monuments, perhaps in synthetic DNA itself, we increase the chances that something survives, that the next civilization doesn't start from absolute zero, that they find our messages and learn from us, even if they don't understand everything, even if our most sophisticated knowledge is lost, even fragments would help. Even the awareness that people before us knew these things can inspire research, can preserve the concept that knowledge is worth seeking. This is what the Sumerian king list does for us. We don't fully understand it. We can't take the numbers literally, but we know it encodes something important, something about deep time, about cycles, about the relationship between civilization and catastrophe. And that awareness changes how we think about history, makes us more humble, more aware of our own fragility, more interested in learning from the past. Perhaps that's all the ancient world could do for us. Plant seeds of awareness, preserve fragments, hope that we'd be wise enough to recognize their significance, and perhaps that's all we can do for the future. Preserve what we can, encode what we consider most important, hope that whoever comes after will find it, study it, learn from it. We can't control whether our civilization survives. Too many variables, too many potential catastrophes beyond our control, but we can control what we try to preserve, what we consider worth saving, what messages we encode for the future. And in choosing what to preserve, we reveal what we value, what we think matters most. If we preserve only technology, schematics for machines, chemical formulas, mathematical equations, we are saying, this is what made us successful, replicate these. But if we also preserve wisdom, stories about cooperation and sustainability, warnings about the consequences of overreach, principles for living in balance with the earth, we're saying we succeeded in some ways, but we also failed. Learn from both. The second approach is more honest, more useful, more likely to help the next civilization avoid our mistakes. And maybe that's the real point of the cyclical view of history. Not to make us fatalistic, we're doomed to repeat the pattern forever, but to make us thoughtful. If we accept that civilizations rise and fall, that ours is not immune, that catastrophe is not a question of if but when, and we start thinking differently, we start thinking about legacy, about what we'll leave behind, about what future humans will find when they dig through our ruins. We start thinking in longer time frames, not quarterly earnings, but centuries, not election cycles, but generations. We start asking, what are we building that will last? What knowledge are we preserving that might survive us? What are we teaching our children that they can pass forward? These are the questions the Sumerian king list forces us to ask. These are the lessons encoded in the Hindu yugas, in the Greek ages, in the flood myths worldwide. You're part of a cycle. It's bigger than you, older than you. It will continue after you. Your civilization is not the first, it won't be the last. But what you do matters, what you preserve matters, what you pass forward matters, not because you'll personally see the result. You won't. The cycle extends far beyond any individual lifetime, but because you're part of something larger, a chain of humanity stretching back to the first, humans who looked at the stars and wondered, and stretching forward to the last humans who will ever live, who will still look at those same stars and wonder. You're a link in that chain, and the strength of the chain depends on each link doing its part, preserving, passing forward, remembering. The Sumerians did their part. They preserved the king list, encoded knowledge in clay, built cities that lasted thousands of years, developed writing that we can still read. The Egyptians did their part. They built monuments that still stand, encoded mathematics in stone, preserved mummies that we can still DNA test. The Maya did their part. They developed sophisticated calendars, created art and architecture that survived the jungle, left inscriptions we're still deciphering. Every civilization does its part, contributes to the chain, passes something forward, and then falls, makes room for the next. Becomes a layer in the archaeological record, a set of myths in the next culture's oral tradition, a mystery for future historians to ponder. This is not tragic, it's natural. It's the way the pattern works, the way the cycle turns, the way deep time unfolds. Civilizations, like individual humans, are temporary. But knowledge, wisdom, pattern, these can survive, can be passed forward, can accumulate over cycles, so that even though we're not the first, even though we'll fall like all the others before us, we're still advancing, still climbing, still learning. The seventh civilization, if we number ourselves that way, knows more than the sixth, has access to more accumulated knowledge, stands on the shoulders of more giants, and the eighth will know more than the seventh, and the ninth more than the eighth, until, perhaps, some distant civilization finally breaks the cycle, finally achieves sustainability, finally balances growth with wisdom, technology with understanding, progress with humility. That civilization, whenever it emerges, will owe a debt to all of us. To every civilization that preserved fragments, passed forward knowledge, encoded wisdom in stone and story. They will read our Sumerian king list, whatever form it takes, whatever medium we use, and they will understand, they will recognize the pattern, see themselves in the cycle, feel the weight of deep time, and they will choose differently, build differently, think differently, not because they're smarter than us, not because they're more moral, but because they have the accumulated wisdom of every fallen civilization before them, every mistake we made, every warning we encoded, every fragment we preserved. That's the hope embedded in the cyclical view of history, that each cycle preserves a little more, passes forward a little more, until finally the accumulation reaches critical mass, and the cycle breaks, not through catastrophe but through wisdom, through finally learning the lessons that every previous civilization tried to teach. We may not be that civilization, we may be doomed to fall like all the others, but we can be the civilization that passed forward the knowledge that helped the final civilization succeed. That's legacy enough. That's purpose enough. That's worth preserving. Let the last thoughts drift away now like smoke from an ancient hearth, rising into the night sky, dissipating into stars. We began tonight with a clay prism in a museum, 8 inches of baked mud, covered in wedge-shaped marks, telling an impossible story of kings who ruled for thousands of years before a flood swept everything away. We've travelled far from that prism, through Hindu temples and Greek philosophy, through flood myths spanning the globe, through the cycles of history, the rise and fall of ages. And we've arrived at a simple possibility, haunting and hopeful at once. What we call history might be only the latest chapter in a much longer story. A story of civilizations rising and falling, like tides, like seasons, like breath itself. We are not the first, we will not be the last. But we are here now, in this moment, in this civilization, and what we do with our time matters, even if our time is limited. We can preserve, we can remember, we can learn from the past and pass wisdom to the future. We can build boats against the coming flood, whatever form that flood takes. We can encode our most important truths in ways that might survive us. We can look at the ancient tablets not with nostalgia for a lost golden age, but with recognition that golden ages and dark ages are both part of the pattern, and the pattern itself is neither good nor bad. It simply is, and within that pattern we have freedom. The freedom to choose how we rise and how we fall and what we leave behind. The Sumerians chose to leave us their king list, a chronicle of impossible reigns, a marker of the flood, a continuation into the future they could not see. They passed the story forward, and here we are, thousands of years later, still reading it, still wondering what it means. What will we pass forward? What will the 7th civilization find when they dig through the layers of our time? Will they find only plastic and concrete decaying into sediment, or will they find something else? Something that tells them who we were, what we knew, what we tried to preserve? Will they look at our ruins the way we look at Sumerian tablets? With wonder, with confusion, with the nagging sense that something important is encoded here. If only we could decode it. These questions don't need answers tonight. They need only to be asked. And as you drift into sleep, as consciousness fades into dreams, let these ideas settle into your unconscious mind. Let them percolate, transform, become something new. Perhaps you'll dream of clay tablets, of floods and survivors, of civilizations rising from ashes. Perhaps you'll wake with new perspective on our own moment in the great cycle. Or perhaps you'll simply sleep well and wake refreshed, and continue living your life with a quiet awareness that you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Either way, the story continues, the cycle turns, and somewhere in a museum in Oxford, a clay prism waits patiently for the next person who will pause and read and wonder. If this journey through the cycles of time stayed with you, alike helps other wanderers find these explorations into the forgotten corners of history. More paths through the ancient world wait in the playlist. Continue whenever you're ready. Share your thoughts below. I'm always curious what resonates, what questions linger in the quiet hours. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.